Good morning, everyone. This is Ranger Jake here in Yellowstone National Park. And first off, I want to say thanks for joining us on the next installment of our 150th anniversary virtual video series. Today, we are in Fort Yellowstone, and directly over my shoulder here, you can see we're standing along Officers Row. Have these really cool historic buildings, beige colored, big red roofs, big line of cottonwood trees in the front of them. If you've been to Fort Yellowstone before, you probably recognize where we're filming. And the reason we're in Fort Yellowstone today is because we're talking about the past, present, and future of Fort Yellowstone. And today, to do that, we're joined by Zehra Osman. Zehra's been working in the park for over 20 years. And a little less than half of that, a little under 10 years, she's been working as our cultural resources specialist. So she's got a lot of great information to share with us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'll jump behind the camera and we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to this part of Yellowstone's 150th anniversary virtual video series. We're going to talk about historic buildings today, and specifically about historic buildings here in Fort Yellowstone. As Jake said, my name is Zehra Osman, and as a cultural resource specialist, I work in the branch of cultural resources management. Yellowstone National Park has this really rich and broad cultural history that spans over 11,000 years of human activity. At the very end of that 11,000 year period or time span, the last 130 years after the park was established is when a lot of these historic buildings began to be constructed. This fort represents some of the oldest buildings that we have in that time period. My role in being a steward for these cultural resources is to help coordinate the projects that affect these buildings. And I work with an interdisciplinary team. I work with the park archaeologist and with the museum curator looking at some historic photographs. And I also work with our facilities management division, and they are the folks who actually get in there and do the hands-on projects that yield some really beautiful results. Work with concessioners. Our concessioners are actually partners, and they lease mostly historic buildings, and they take really good care of them as well. We have over 600 buildings in Yellowstone National Park. There used to be more, but right now we have about 600 of them. And most of those were built within that first 100 years of the parks, since the park's establishment. But today I'm only going to talk about a subset of all those buildings. I'm going to talk about Fort Yellowstone, and I'm also going to talk about a really exciting, fantastic project that was funded through the Great American Outdoors Act. And I'm really excited to share that with you as well. To talk about Fort Yellowstone, though, first I have to explain why we have a fort in Yellowstone. And to do that, I need to go back in history, and I need to go back to 1872 and talk about why the fort is here. In 1872, when the park was established, the park superintendents were tasked with managing and taking care of these millions of acres, but there was no National Park Service at that time. There was no funding or resources or staff, and they didn't have the experience. I mean, this was the first time we had a national park in the whole world, so they didn't really have the experience, and so they were faced with a lot of challenges. During that time, the Secretary of the Interior contacted and reached out to the Secretary of War and asked for assistance. So in 1886, the U.S. Army arrived here in Fort Yellowstone. Well, actually, it wasn't Fort Yellowstone yet. They arrived in Mammoth Hot Springs, and which is where we're standing today. They spent the first 5 years living in tents, going through some really cold and isolated winters, and then in 1891 they started building some of these permanent buildings and structures, and eventually they were, by the end of the time that they were here, which is 32 years later, they had built over 60 buildings throughout the park, over 40 of them here in Fort Yellowstone. Here's a photo of Fort Yellowstone, and in this photo you can see the fort has just begun being constructed. The fort is built on what looks to be white ground, and that white ground is actually travertine. And if you think about it, Mammoth Hot Springs gets its name from the Mammoth Hot Springs terraces. That's a hydrothermal feature that is quite remarkable, and that hydrothermal process results in calcium carbonate being all over the ground here. And if you think about it, that's chalk. And so chalk, if you can imagine, if during that time there were wagons and horses, and that chalk just got pulverized under those wagon wheels and horse hoofs. So that was a very dusty and sandy environment, and that is kind of the story behind why there is a white ground underneath all of those buildings. Then I'd like to share what happened. This was towards the end of the time that the Army was in Fort Yellowstone, and this shows, and it's a photo from 1915, and now the fort is all built out. And you can see there are lawns. The Army came in and took care of the sandy, dusty conditions and put in some lawns. They also put in sidewalks and streets, and the cottonwood trees that we see here planted all in a row along the parade ground. So we had quite a lot of development that happened during the 32 years that they were here. Today, I'd like to kind of fast forward to present day. Our park headquarters is located here in Fort Yellowstone, just like it was back during that time. And we take care of these buildings here in Fort Yellowstone. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2003. And we take care of them, and it's a challenge because it's really a challenge to be a historic building here in Yellowstone. If you can imagine, these buildings have been here for 130 years. That's 130 Yellowstone winters. That's 130 years of occasional earthquakes and seismic activity. Some long drawn out spring times, which we get, where the snow on top of the roof thaws and refreezes and thaws and refreezes, and that just wreaks havoc on the building components. And also during that 130 years, there have been times where funding was kind of lean, and there wasn't a lot of money being funneled into these buildings. Well, a few years ago, very recently, Yellowstone Park management set some new strategic priorities for the park. And part of those priorities included rehabilitating and updating employee housing. Because if you think about it, employee housing is critical to our mission. The employees who rent these quarters for housing are the same employees who are stewards for the park resources. They're the same employees who are taking care of the roads and providing visitor services. Well, in that strategic priority, there was a goal to rehabilitate deteriorating historic housing. Well, timing is everything, and the Great American Outdoors Act yielded some funding for Yellowstone National Park. We were able to get funding to rehabilitate 17 buildings here in this fort. That's 17 buildings that provide residences for park employees. If you break that down to the numbers of employees who are housed, it's 27 employees and their families who live in those 17 buildings. So this is a project that's going to rehabilitate the exteriors of these buildings and to rehabilitate the exteriors of these buildings. And it's probably the largest historic preservation project done at all one time in the National Park Service. This was a great opportunity not only for the project and the buildings themselves, but it was also a really great opportunity for the Yellowstone Park staff. We were able to work with nationally recognized experts in historic preservation. For example, the Historic Preservation Training Center, which is a National Park Service office that houses some of the best brains for historic preservation in the country. But also we teamed up with the private sector, with a private architectural firm that does historic preservation. They helped us to look at building condition assessments and to assess root causes of problems and to better understand the challenges that we faced with this project. This is a photo taken of the double officers' quarters. The photo was taken in 1905, and this building was built in 1891. It had a red metal shingle roof, and it had white wood-clad siding. And today, the building looks very similar. The building has actually a lot of integrity. But as we zoom in closer to the building, we can see that there is some wear and tear. The building has some peeling paint on the walls. The front part of the building where the porch is partially buried in the soil, and that's terrible because that's a good way for moisture and pests to get into the wood components. The stone foundation is cracking and there's missing mortar. And the ground around the building has just kind of built up over time, and it's not draining away from the building.
And I noticed in those two pictures right here, it looks like there's wood siding on the right, like in the newer photo, but what was the original siding on the housing on the initial? Was it wood, and I'm just not seeing it? Or?
It is. It's wood siding, and the wood siding was. Yes, the photo doesn't have the same resolution, but it is the siding that is on these buildings is the exact same siding that the Army put on back during the time that they were here.
So meaning like that siding is the siding that was installed, or it's a similar siding, or that's the original siding?
That's the original siding.
Wow. Yeah.
That siding was touched by the same troops that lived here back during that time.
That's crazy.
That's amazing. That's historic fabric, and that's an important part of the historic integrity that we try to preserve. Great question. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah.
Well, talking about that siding, I have another photo that kind of zooms in and talks about moisture drive. We noticed that the peeling paint on the buildings was a continual problem. We would paint the buildings, and it wasn't very long after that the paint would just pop off. And we ended up having lots of discussions with these historic preservation experts about why that was happening. But first, they pointed out something that we had not realized. If you look at these two photos, and you see that in the older photo, which is black and white, there is something missing in the newer photo from 2022. So in the 1905 photo, along the very edge of the roof eave is an integral rain gutter. In the 2022 photo, that rain gutter is gone. The reason it's gone is rain gutters never last in this climate. The snow and ice just take them right off. They clog, the ice backs up into and creates ice dams. But the Army had designed these buildings with that in mind, that the gutters would take the water that drained off the roof over to a downspout, down into the ground or towards a part of the ground that drained away from the building. Well, when those gutters came off, that water just sheet drained right down the face of the exterior of the building. And anything in the path of that water, whether it was paint that was already peeling, that paint peeled even more. If there was a window in the way, that window started to deteriorate. And the same thing with trim. When the water got down to the ground, if the ground did not slope away from the building, and over the 130 years, that became more and more of an issue. The ground did not slope away, and so that water just pooled at the base of the building. And if you can imagine, it froze sometimes, it stayed stagnant, it kind of went back into the foundation, and now we are understanding why we are having some issues with our foundation and with some of the deterioration. with the peeling paint, what we found out is there is this process that happens where the warm and humid air inside the building moves through the wall system to the outside where the air is cold and dry. And when that vapor does that, anything in its path that is not breathable or permeable has pressure put on it. So if you think about it, there was 130 years of painting that was done to these buildings. And along the way, we had some synthetic paints that were put on the building that created like a synthetic shell. So when that vapor hit that synthetic shell, it just popped it right off. And now we're understanding why it was that we were having trouble keeping paint on the building exterior. And boy, that really does make these buildings look terrible.
You can see like directly over your shoulder, that whole
Yeah,
side of the building, I mean, is like just a lot of paint missing. Yeah.
absolutely. So this project, which is currently in the design phase, is going to address these issues. I mean, it's going to address a lot of issues, but the ones that I'll present to you here today that I thought were kind of interesting is that we are going to fix that roof edge where we used to have a gutter. Now the gutters are going to be on the ground. So we're going to fix the roof edge so that the water, instead of cascading down the side of the wall, it's going to drip down, right down onto the ground. And on the ground, we're going to grade that ground surface so that the water drains directly away from the building. And to address the permeable paint issue, we're going to strip all of the paint off of the wood siding, off of the windows, off of the trim, and we're going to replace it with breathable products that have proven to be resistant to this the issues that we face with moisture drive. During that process, we're going to repair siding. In many cases, the siding is actually that original wood siding is in good shape. That's going to stay on the building. And for the windows, they are also, we did a condition assessment on all of them, and most of them, a majority of them are in good shape because they were protected by storm windows. And those storm windows have changed over time, but we will be repairing those windows, stripping the paint off, putting on the better breathable paint, and then we're going to weatherize those windows and add energy efficient storm windows to the exterior so that we can improve the energy efficiency of these buildings. We're going to do the same thing with the exterior walls. We're going to add some more insulation. And while we're doing that, we're also going to beef up the structural integrity of the buildings to meet current building codes for structural framing and that sort of thing. So, talking about stewardship going into the future. This project is amazing in that we're going to be remedying so many issues all at the same time. But we're also able to take the knowledge that we have gained in this project and apply it to projects we're working on right now in other places in the park. Other places here in Mammoth Hot Springs, at Old Faithful. Going forward, this project is going to have lots of great ripple effects for preservation for the park's historic buildings. And if you think about it, we have a lot of goals in cultural resources management. We're governed to take care of these resources because of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. But more than that, cultural resources, once they're gone, they can never be recovered. They allow us to connect one generation to another. They allow us to look at the world, put ourselves in the shoes of the people who lived here during that time. And if you think about it, the people who take the walking tour through Fort Yellowstone, and you can do that virtually as well, by the way, that they look at buildings that are authentic. They could see the workmanship and the handwork of the Army troops who built these buildings. And And in so doing, they can maybe put themselves in the shoes of the people who lived here during that time, the people who had never had any experience in making this new idea of the world's first national park become a reality, and they figured it out and passed along what they learned and some of their traditions to the National Park Service. And we hope that you'll be able to take a look at these buildings in person or virtually. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening. And I also want to say, take a look at the park website. There's some great videos and information that talk about the history of the park, and you can learn a little bit more about our cultural resources management programs.
So before we sign off, I have, you mentioned, that passing the knowledge, from the Army to the National Park Service, and we have all these great archives. So I'm assuming as part of this project, you had to do a little bit of research. And the question I had is, in your research, is there anything for the people who are going to come do this tour, is there anything that you'd like to call out, like specifically like a building or just something to think about that like really kind of stood out to you in your research?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes. In looking at the historic plans and documents and reading about these buildings and also looking at the historic photo images, what occurred to us is what you see here has great historic integrity. The buildings have not really changed. Even the setting has not really changed. Yes, we have modern cars parked behind the buildings, but we still have very similar conditions. And when you compare a 1905 photo to a 2022 photo, you're going to be able to see lots of similarities, and that kind of historic integrity is remarkable, and it's what we strive for.
Awesome. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off, and I just want to thank Zehra for joining us today and talking about the fort. This is a really cool place, and a lot of when you come to national parks, it's not always for buildings, but this is one of those things that, the fort itself, and then the GOA project, and being the largest cultural resources rehabilitation project, that's a really big deal. So we're really proud of that. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for joining us in the next 150th anniversary virtual video series. We appreciate you following along this year. Thank you for your support of Yellowstone, and we'll catch you on the next video.
Bye.